We had a couple of folk tales. One from Appalachia, one from the Cherokee. We had a ghost story from Scotland. How about a personal story? Never done that. Do you want me to be little in this story or a grown up?
Whatever you choose.
Little. When I was a little girl, I lived across the street from the church. We're talking about stained glass windows as we came in here, because you all have some beautiful interiors. There was a beautiful stained glass window in the front of the church across from my home. It was a depiction of Jesus with a lamb in his arm and sheep all around his feet. I bet you've seen one like it, haven't you? But the important thing about it for me was at the bottom of it was a big brass plaque. And on the plaque it said, "In loving memory of Elizabeth Ellis." I knew that that was my grandmother and that she had died before I was born. But we had been sharing that name ever since I came into the world, and so I figured she really wouldn't mind if we shared that window. I thought of it as being my window. It had my name on it. I like to sit in the front pew and watch the light come through the window and make colored patterns on the floor. And think about things I thought were important. I don't remember my father, although I've strained and strained to try to do that. But I was in the first grade before they sorted out all the great madness of World War II and began shipping bodies home that had first been buried in France. So although I don't remember my father, I remember his funeral really well. Don't you think that's strange? Me too. I remember that his casket arrived covered by an American flag and accompanied by a man in a dress uniform with the shiniest shoes I had ever seen in my lifetime. Everybody in the neighborhood gathered in to pay their respects. Maybe not so much to my father, who'd already been dead for 5 years by then, but to my mother, whom they saw every day. In the middle of the afternoon, the minister of the church across the street came to call, and we were surprised to see him. We didn't attend his church. Every Sunday, we got into our old Chevrolet and went putt-putting into town to a church of a different persuasion. But Reverend Edwards went around and he got his cake and his coffee, and he came and sat down, and when he had taken care of the cake and coffee business, he patted the seat beside him and indicated my mother should come and sit with him, and she did. And he told her that he had come to call on us that day because he wanted to make sure she understood how important it was that she bring my older brother and me to his Sunday school on Sunday. And that way we could learn the right way of thinking about things, and that way we could be baptized in the right manner, and then we wouldn't go to hell when we died like my daddy had. And that's when, for the first time all day, my mother started to cry. And that's when I spit on Reverend Edwards. There's more than one form of baptism. Well, after I spit on him, Reverend Edwards never wanted me around anymore. Every time he would find me in the church looking at that window, he would escort me out and lock the doors behind me. He took to locking all the doors and windows because I was never a child that could take a hint. I spent a real miserable 2 weeks without that window until I noticed the coal chute at the back of the church. I could walk around toward the kitchen door and pull down that metal flap and launch myself. Slide down the coal chute and land on the pile of coal, get up, dust myself off, walk upstairs, sit in any pew I wanted to, watch the light come through the window. After a while, I found out that if you laid down in the pew, nobody could see your head or your feet. You could stay there a long time. Nobody would realize you were there. But every once in a while, Reverend Edwards would spot me and throw me out of the church again. It was like a dance we did together. The summer I turned 12, I spent the entire summer at my grandmother and grandfather's in Kentucky. When we came back to Tennessee, the day before school started, I was so eager to see that window, I didn't wait until my mother had stopped the car. As soon as she turned into our driveway, I threw up in the back door and started running across the yard and across the street to the church. I wanted to be able to say truthfully later, I didn't hear you. I was in that big a hurry to see the window. I went around to the back of the building, I pulled down the trap, and I launched myself. It only took me a moment to discover that during the summer, my body had betrayed me. And I was never going to be able to make that trip again. It only took me another minute to discover how tightly I was stuck. I wiggled and there was no way I was moving, either up or down. And I realized I was going to have to get help, even if it came from Reverend Edwards. So I opened my mouth and I began to yell. And after a while, I felt a pair of hands take hold of my ankles. And I braced myself for the sight of that overly red face and those distended neck veins I had come to know so well over the years. When I was out in the sunlight, blubbering and wiping cold soot in every direction, there was a man I'd never seen before. He said, "What are you doing?" It was such a reasonable question, I was sorry I didn't have a reasonable answer. He took me by the hand and we went around the edge of the church and went into the kitchen door. It wasn't locked. He put me at the kitchen table. And then he turned around and took 2 water glasses out of the cabinet and put them down on the table in front of me. He turned around to the refrigerator and took out the biggest bottle of Welch's grape juice I'd ever seen in my lifetime. And he poured a great, big, healthy slug of grape juice into each of those glasses. And then he turned back to the sink and turned on the tap. And he put the grape juice bottle right under the stream of water and watched very carefully until it reached exactly the level it had been before he'd taken out any juice, put the cap on, gave it a shake, put it back in the refrigerator. And I thought that anybody who would do that would like to see my window. And so I told him we could go upstairs and sit in the pews and watch the light come through the window, but we'd have to be awfully quiet, because if Reverend Edwards found us, he would throw us out of the church. And he said, "Throw you out of the church? Why on earth would the man do a thing like that?" And I explained to him how I had spit on Reverend Edwards when I was just a little girl. I think he got choked on the grape juice because his face turned really red and he was making a really funny noise. It sounded sort of like coughing, but maybe not. But I was worried about him, so I started pounding him on the back. And as soon as he could get his breath, he said, we didn't have to be quiet at all. We could go upstairs, sit in the pews, and watch the light come through the window, that Reverend Edwards wasn't there anymore, that he'd gone away, and that he was the minister of the church now. And I told him how if you laid down in the pew, nobody would see your head or your feet. You could stay there a long time and no one would know you were there. And he said he thought that'd be a handy thing to know. So we took our grape juice and we went upstairs. We sat in the front pew, me on one side of the aisle and him on the other. We sipped our grape juice and watched the light come through the window. I showed him how it would make a pattern on the carpet with the different colors. And he showed me how if you held your grape juice up, it would make a tiny little pattern coming through your grape juice. And then we heard a car pull up outside. So he laid down in the pew. Somebody opened the big double doors and they called out, "Is anybody here?" We didn't make a sound. And as soon as he heard the car drive away, he laughed till the tears rolled down his cheeks. And then I told him I knew I had to go home because I knew I was already in big trouble. And he said, "Come back anytime, the doors won't be locked. I don't believe in locking churches. Somebody might want to get in. They might want to pray." So the next day, when school let out, I rode the bus home like I always did. But I didn't go to my house when I got off the bus. I went straight to the church. I was already old enough to know that you never knew when grown-ups were telling you the truth. I gotta tell you, I think the scariest moment of my entire life today has been when I put my hand on that door latch. But it wasn't long. And I walked in, went down the main aisle and sat down in the front row and drank what was left out of my lunch bag. It was tomato juice, but I didn't care. I had the window to look at. I didn't need any patterns on the carpet. In the room that had been Reverend Edwards' study, I could hear the sound of typing. And I knew that meant there was a woman in there and I didn't want to bother anybody. So I just sat there and watched the window. So many things had changed in my life while I was gone. 3 months was such a long time to be without the window. I had a lot of serious thinking to do. So every day after school, I came straight to the church. Every day I sat in the front pew. By Friday, I was getting curious. And I tiptoed over to the doorway of the room that had been Reverend Edwards' study and peeked around the door sill. And the room didn't look at all like it had looked when Reverend Edwards was there. Now, there were bookcases on all 4 walls from the floor to the ceiling. Can you imagine being rich enough to have bookcases that go from the floor to the ceiling? In the very middle of the room, there was a desk because there was no place else to put it. Sitting at the desk was my new friend, and he was typing fast. He looked up and said, "Oh, there you are. I wondered where you'd gotten to." When he saw the look on my face, he said, "Do you like books?" I said, "Oh, yes, sir, very much." He said, "Well, come in and look around. I bet you take a whole stack of books home from the public library every week." No, sir. The books in the library, they're for the kids who live in the city. If you live out here in the country, they won't let you have any of their books. I've been trying to get a book out of that library since I was 5, and they've never let me have one yet. He said, "That's too bad. I bet you get a whole bunch of books from the school library every week." I said, "I sure do. I'd read every book in the school library by the time I was at the end of the 4th grade. So whenever they get a new book, they always give it to me first." He said, "Well, that's nice. Why don't you look among my books? You might find a book you want to take home and read. I trust you to take good care of it." I couldn't believe that he knew me so little, but he was willing to put that much faith in me. The library never trusted me with any of their books. So I went over to one wall and I began to look, and all the books were big and thick and fat, and they all ended in the same letters, O-L-O-G-Y. Again and again, different O-L-O-G-Y. But between two big fat O-L-O-G-Ys, I found a very thin blue book. I thought that was my best shot. So I carried it up to his desk and I said, "I'd like to take this one, please." He looked at it and he said, "An excellent choice. A lot of people read Soren Kierkegaard." I took the book home and it only took me 10 minutes to discover that Kierkegaard and I were never going to be best friends. But I put it under my pillow and I kept it what I hoped would end up being the right number of days, 7 exactly. And then I took it back. I was terrified that he was going to ask me what I thought of it. But he didn't. He said, "Are you finished with it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, look on that wall back there. You didn't look on that wall when you were here before." So I began to look on that wall. In the middle of all those O-L-O-G-Ys that were different from those O-L-O-G-Ys, I found a thin gray book. Stamped on the front of the book was a chifforobe. It looked exactly like the chifforobe in my bedroom across the street. So I carried it up to his desk and I said, "I'd like to take this one, please." And he said, "An excellent choice. A lot of people read C.S. Lewis." And I took home The Lion, the Witch, and the Chifforobe. And the next day when I brought it back, I wasn't at all worried he would ask what I thought. But he didn't. He just said, "Are you finished with it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, keep looking. The one that comes after is bound to be here somewhere. I just haven't been here long enough to get my books in order. Say, you wouldn't like to come on Saturday morning and help me do that, would you?" "Oh, yes, sir. I'd like that very much." So after I read all the books in the Narnia series and looked up C.S. Lewis in the encyclopedia, I took home Black Beauty, and then Treasure Island, and then the collected fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, and after that I kind of forget. I was slow as a child. I was in my early 20s when I realized that those books had been put there for me to find. I think it's when I got a divorce I didn't really want and began to see all those books appearing on the shelves that were about becoming a successful single parent that the light finally began to dawn. It seemed to me that this story's over. To honor my old friend, Dr. Crowder, I would ask you what you thought of it. I'll say, "Are you finished with it?" I thought